Welcome. Welcome, everyone, and greetings from so many places in the world. And I know you're all streaming in little by little, but we just want to start because we have a very exciting panel. So my name is Yolande Miller-Granvaux. I lead with other wonderful colleagues at FHI 360, the GREEN, the Global Response to Education and the Environment Network, which really strives to bring together practitioners, researchers, thinkers, leaders who are so concerned about the incorporation of climate into education systems and services. So today, this is our thought leadership webinar, and of course, our partners in crime, Riley Justice from Take Action Global and Lauren Simmons from Save the Children US are going to present our panelists and talk about practice and policy. Riley, the floor is yours. Please, in the chat, tell us where you come from. Sorry, Riley.
No, you're fine. Thank you so much, Yolande. Thank you, Sam, for coordinating. And I am so excited to be with you today to really jump back into this conversation with some amazing panelists from around the United States to talk about policy and practice in education. But before I did that, I want to kind of go backwards a little bit to talk about where we came from in the last couple of webinars and jump into some different concepts. And then we will try to rush through that to get to our panel, because that's what we're all here for today, is the panel conversation. So as Yolande introduced me, I'm Riley Justice. I am the COO of Take Action Global. We are an international nonprofit working with students around the world in 162 countries to bring climate action education to everyone. So I want to give Lauren an opportunity to quickly introduce herself, and then we'll jump in.
And I'll be very efficient. So my name is Lauren Simmons. I'm a climate and education advisor with Save the Children US, and have been very passionate about climate education and climate action within education, and I'm so excited to have this panel.
And we have some amazing guests today. We have another Lauren, Dr. Lauren Madden from the College of New Jersey. So Lauren, if you want to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lauren Madden. I'm a professor of elementary science education, and I coordinate the environmental sustainability education programming at the College of New Jersey. And I've done a lot of research about the rollout of these new standards we have related to climate change here in New Jersey.
Wonderful. So great to have you. And we have Elaine. And Elaine, I'm going to slaughter your last name, so I'm going to let you say it. So please introduce yourself from Subject to Climate.
Good morning and hello, everyone. I'm Elaine Makrovich, and I am in New Jersey. I am a K-6 elementary educator. I retired in June of last year with 30 years of teaching, all subjects, all grade levels. Sustainability, environmental education have always been a passion of mine. With Subject to Climate, I've written lessons for our New Jersey hub, as well as now I'm our New Jersey state lead and the director of state leads as we are expanding to 6 hubs in 6 states throughout the US. I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you, Riley.
Absolutely. So great to have you both, and we'll jump more into the conversation here in a moment. But when we talk about each of these webinars that we've really had the conversation about is setting the stage. We want to set the stage for what we're talking about when we talk about climate education, when we talk about sustainability education, when we talk about each of these different things, and really trying to break down some of those linguistic barriers. In our research, we've found that is a major component of clarifying our work around these 3 components that we like to look at: climate, action, and education. We talk about high quality education practices. We talk about the importance of climate and sustainability. And we like to focus on taking action as a community, as a school, and as a state in the case of New Jersey that we'll talk about today. So we've had a couple big questions that we've tried to tackle and introduce to the group over the last number of months when we're talking about things like global impact, systems readiness, and educational outcomes. We've talked about reflective need, theory of change, and human-centered design. So I invite you to kind of take a look at some of those previous conversations when we talked about kind of the concepts around climate education and the work of why we're doing this, and then brought it to practical of what are some actual programs and actual options that we can bring forward in these conversations. And then today, really jumping into this idea of taking it to implementation, where we're bringing policy and standards together with professional development and impact to really push us forward in this kind of conversation around climate action education and how can we do it at a statewide level through policy and impact. So I want to hand it to Lauren to talk kind of about the state of climate education across the United States.
Sure, thank you, Riley. So New Jersey was a pioneer in this effort to roll out not just climate education as a standalone idea, but really the integration of climate education into all subjects, presenting the sort of holistic worldview, cross-cutting worldview that we're hoping to see replicated elsewhere. Now, having said that, we'll hear more about New Jersey's model, but there are other states within the United States that are implementing various measures around environmental education or climate education explicitly. Maine has initiated a 3-year pilot program to provide grants for teacher professional development and support partnerships with community organizations, prioritizing historically underserved communities around the idea of climate change and environmental health, the natural and built environments around us. Washington State's Climb Time program mandates climate science training for all teachers across all grades, which aligns with the next generation science standards, NGSS standards. And then as we'll talk about later, New Jersey requires climate change education across all subjects, across all grades, and is supported by a significant allocation for grants and resources to help schools implement these standards in classrooms. But that said, even though this is just at the state level, there are many local municipalities and some significant local municipalities that are passing either acts or funding climate education. For example, in Los Angeles, they've established a California Center for Climate Change Education within its community college district, focusing on career pathways and workforce training and green jobs. Montgomery County, Maryland, which is right outside DC, supports, they have a comprehensive climate action plan, which it could be a separate conversation unto itself, but promotes sustainability in schools and increasing green school certification, so LEED certifications in that case. And then Portland, Oregon, aims to reduce the school district's carbon emissions and enhance health and well-being and educate students about climate justice in particular. And they have a goal of eliminating fossil fuel infrastructure or fossil fuel supported infrastructure within schools by 2050. So it's not just New Jersey, there's momentum across the states, and you can see a lot of activity happening within individual classrooms and led by individual educators who are very passionate about this subject, who are sharing with other educators across the country, and many times there's momentum coming from the bottom up.
I think it's such an important point, Lauren, that these are happening across the United States in several states, several cities. But what we go back to, just like in our climate education in the classroom, is it's very much pocketed. One state may be taking the lead on it, or another state may be learning about it. But what we need to do is kind of what we're doing today. Highlighting a state, highlighting the successes they're having, and even some of the challenges that they're having as well, because we can all learn from those. As we start to look at the state of Illinois, just passed in their House a climate bill that's moving forward, hopefully to the governor's table here shortly, but we're seeing some progression in this work around the country. So very excited to see kind of what's happening and how we're going to move this forward as a group. So today's big questions are really going to focus on these 3 things. We're going to look at the statewide approach that New Jersey has taken, both on the policy side, but also on the funding solution side or implementation side, because they've seen some different works, they've done some different processes, they've tried some different exploration and had varied levels of success in that process. We're going to look at how it aligns to those needs. How does it align to educational needs? How does it align to climate needs? And what are we actually measuring through that process? Great question the other day in our green conversation actually was, are we measuring climate education for the measurement of education outcomes or climate mitigation outcomes? Or are we measuring both? Those conversations I think are going to be so important as we look through this process and really dive into some of this work. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and jump back to my panel questions here, if I can figure out my screen situation.
Do you want me to, I can start, I can pick
Sure.
up that, Haley. Sure. Well, for our esteemed panelists here, Lauren, Elaine, we wanted to get started or get a sense first of what were the primary motivations? What spurred the development and implementation of this initiative of climate education standards in New Jersey? Lauren, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. So this really, it's sometimes to get these sorts of things moving, you really need a champion. And New Jersey's First Lady, Tammy Murphy, was certainly that person. One of her main goals as First Lady of our state when the Murphy administration began was this vision of having comprehensive climate change education. She'd worked closely with the Climate Reality Project for years. So this was sort of an idea that was out there, and then right around 2020, the announcement was made that New Jersey would have these comprehensive climate change education standards from K through 12 in all subjects, not just science, which made things a little bit different. In most other places, when we talk about climate, even in science, we start at fifth grade or middle school. So it was definitely a giant expansion.
So Elaine, when you're thinking about that time, because you were in the classroom during 2020, which has all kinds of ramifications in the conversation. Obviously, what was going on was crazy. But when we talk about like a systems level approach or systems level change, did you feel engaged in that process? Were educators really brought to the table? Who was engaged across the state in some of those conversations?
So I think what's remarkable about this process, as Lauren said, having that champion, but then connecting to all the important stakeholders. So I wasn't an educator on one of those committees that was working closely on the language and how to include and where to include. But within my district, when we were doing curriculum revision very soon after the standards were adopted, that was part of our work, was pouring back through the adopted curriculum that we had in our district and looking at those new standards and making sure that they were added to our work. And what I found as a teacher was the intentionality of how they were really placed where they made great sense. For me as an educator, where I saw each standard and a reflection to how this could be brought to a kindergartner or a first grader or a second grader, where we sometimes think of that age being a challenge or a barrier for the understanding. It was placed in there intentionally and integrated into things that we were already doing. So my view as the teacher was, rather than this feeling like another element added into our busy COVID, post-COVID years and such, this was more of a, well, it makes sense where it is and it connects naturally. And I can include this and I can teach this and I can focus on this in a meaningful way that engages my students, that completes the science standards I need to focus on anyway, or can bring in elements of the social studies curriculum. So as I said, though I wasn't in that internal process at the state level, but in my local school district, which is in one of the counties in New Jersey, and every county has their own superintendent. We have a local control in the way that we are all aligned with what the state Department of Education is asking us to do, but we have our own internal controls over what that could look like or how we do that. And so I was fortunate to work in a district where teachers are always part of the curriculum development. So for me, it was a moment of, this is amazing because this will be something teachers can get on board with and be part of as we roll it out.
So just to kind of extend that, Elaine, I want to go to Lauren Madden. The Lauren and Lauren thing's going to throw me off. So Lauren Madden, because of your work kind of at more at the state level, and forgive me for oversimplifying this New Jersey really used a top-down approach. They moved the standards, they then implemented the standards. Through your experience, did you feel like they approach this as a climate solution or a teaching and learning solution to really impact the standards at each of those different levels?
So I'm going to say yes, and
Okay. That's okay.
And I think the state really considered this comprehensively. You know, there have been some predictive studies that have demonstrated that widespread climate education ranks somewhere along the top 25% of the solutions that are given by Project Drawdown. So we do have some data that supports the idea that climate education is a solution, right? And also climate education is preparing students for future careers. And there a lot of the industries of the future will be climate related. It is a top-down approach, and I should also say also for a global audience, something that might be a little bit different here in the US and in New Jersey in particular, is that the standards are all the ideas that everyone has to cover, but the curriculum is the day-to-day plans that teachers use. And we have local control. So that means individual school districts get to make a decision about what curriculum they're using, and all those curriculum are aligned to the standards. So it's not like, I know in some countries there's a state or a federal curriculum that students use. The other piece that's sort of interesting that makes New Jersey a bit unique compared to other states in the US is that this was an executive decision. So this came through the governor's office. This did not go through the legislative process, which is what's happened in places like Connecticut and Illinois. I believe New York has 5 bills currently being discussed. New Hampshire's got a bill on the table. So it's sort of exciting because we were able to see things happen a little bit more quickly. But all that said, this isn't mandating you must teach this lesson on this day. This is saying that these are the broad scope of ideas that need to be covered over the course of a school year.
Excellent. And I think that's so important, to the distinction of this is not a specific resource that you must teach from or a textbook that you must teach from. This is a broad standard that you need to apply in all of your learning. And I think New Jersey did it correctly in saying this needs to be applied across the curriculum, across the standards, across the different areas. Because if we just contain it into science classrooms, then it's limiting the impact or limiting the value of that. So I wanted to throw out the political question, and this is to anybody, either the Lawrence or Elaine. So when we talk about climate change, and this is something for our international audience that is uniquely American in this way, is it's a political topic. You know, we talk about climate change, the scientific consensus around climate change, and each of these different pieces. Did you approach it, Elaine, maybe in the classroom around sustainability, around taking action? Did you approach it in a different form or fashion? Or Lauren, did you see that across the state being approached different ways? Or was it really focused on climate change learning? And how did those kind of feedback come from the communities? I guess I'll go to Elaine first, sorry.
Sure. So I think, as Lauren said, what's uniquely important about New Jersey is that local control of these are the ideas and the way in which it can be handled in a county or in a small district. In my particular experience, I was the K-6 school-wide enrichment and gifted and talented coordinator. So I met with every student K-6 every week for 40 minutes. And a lot of my work centered around our school garden and greenhouse and our outdoor classroom space, which was also a big piece of my passion with teaching. And so the lens of first, environmental science experiences, sustainability. We did a lot of work with thinking through what happens if there's a year where we have more rain or less rain, what happens to our crops, and how can we scale that idea larger with students as they think through what that means across New Jersey for farmers and agriculture. So for my particular experience, I was able to really create lessons that use those standards that attached to what was a focus of our program and sort of add and strengthen the learning. But I know that in other classrooms, it may have been done where a math lesson was approached using data about recent flooding in New Jersey, and it was relevant and place-based for those students. And so that would be the particular way. And I think across New Jersey, we have a wide array of political views and and ideologies and ideas related to sustainability and climate education and climate literacy. And so I think what's valuable here is that teachers can approach it. They know these ideas are there and that they're incorporating them, but they can do it in a meaningful way that doesn't have to necessarily have them put into a particular uncomfortable position or a challenging position, because no one can really argue with the fact that you're teaching a kindergartner to love the planet and experience growing things outside and develop that love and appreciation for nature, which will then transcend and continue as they grow and learn more challenging concepts later on. So I think from my view as the teacher perspective, the political piece didn't come into play in my classroom or need to be a part of what I knew was important and great ideas and lessons for students to experience.
Well, I think that's great, and I think it's so important to really not only highlight the local control, local development piece and the reflective nature of it, but I think it's to back it back down from the political nature of things, to really get to those core teaching elements, as well as what the skills, and as Lauren Madden shared, the green skills, the next generation green skills, because as future jobs are developed and these future opportunities are developed, there's lots that can come from that is related to that specifically. So I wanted to pivot a little bit to Yolan's question, because she teed us up perfectly for the next piece around this idea of supporting educators in the classroom, because we've talked about this in previous webinars. We are dealing with educators that are, for 90% of the time, not climate educators. They're not climate scientists. They're not prepared to really teach the climate standards in the classroom. So have you seen, Lauren, anything around this specifically in your teacher preparation programs or other places to prepare teachers or in-service teachers through professional learning to really support them through that process?
So yes, which has really been wonderful. Last June, we had a workshop for teachers about the climate change standards. It was really sort of at the introductory level. And we had about an hour-and-a-half session in the afternoon where the teachers broke into grade level specific groups to just map out their whole curriculum for the year and think about where it made the most sense to integrate climate change. And unanimously, the teachers came away saying that was the most useful part of that day for them, was really thinking about where does this make sense to fit in. And as Elaine mentioned earlier, at various parts of this whole process, from the standards development to the review to the report I wrote on behalf of New Jersey school boards, we had teacher input at each step along the way. And yes, not every school looks the same, and we've got local control, but we really did try and cast as wide a net as we could to ensure that teachers' voices were part of the conversation, and that when we made recommendations, that they were cognizant of what's really happening in classrooms and they weren't sort of pie in the sky. Over this past year, the state has funded me to do a little bit of research about some pre-service teacher preparation. So we've piloted a program with some of our pre-service teachers at the College of New Jersey, to get them ready to use the standards, to get some good content area background and some next steps for what they're going to do, and familiarization with resources out there, which the Climate Hub that's Subject to Climate and Elaine manage has really been a wonderful resource and a starting point for teachers who might feel a little bit uncertain planning lessons in that area that they might not have had as much background in. So we've been working really hard to sort of get things out there to make sure that current and future teachers have access to good high quality materials and good high quality professional learning so that they feel comfortable teaching this content. So I do have to say we're going to be putting the pre-service teacher modules that we've created out in the world, hopefully in the next month or so. And then also working with Subject to Climate to offer some workshops for teachers, some webinars that they can take to learn a little bit more. And I know they offer a lot of materials as well. So we've been working really hard to get teachers' voices in the conversation the whole time through. So what we recommend, it makes sense and is feasible. But also to try and offer as many opportunities to teachers as possible to increase their own confidence in teaching in this area.
I think a really interesting component, and as you highlighted, Lauren, is there's lots of people doing this work and they're putting these resources out there. through OER or, open educational resources, these different opportunities for free trainings to really bring people up to speed, because we all recognize this is a limitation in the classroom. That we're not all climate scientists, we're not all experts in this field, but really trying to see how we can support educators through that. So wanted to shift a little bit to the other Lauren, to Lauren Simmons, because of your work specifically to Save the Children around this idea of inclusivity, around social climate or climate justice, equity, environmental justice issues. What did you see? What have you seen in New Jersey, but also across the other states, to really support this work in the interconnectedness of climate, quality education, and those social justice issues that we're seeing in education in general?
Yeah, I think Elaine mentioned the concept of place-based learning and place-based grounding what you're learning in the specific place. And I think the most successful models I've seen have been ones in which the curriculum has been explicitly place-based, in that, for example, New Mexico, I think I've mentioned this in our previous webinar, but in partnering with Indigenous groups and master gardeners to lead the development of a school garden curriculum, so that it is not just about a school garden, but it's about a school garden in a specific place that is tied to cultural and historic roots, and emphasizing that in the curriculum and in the learning experience itself. San Francisco has a similar program. But I think that the idea of climate justice is one that has to be named explicit in the guidance that is given regardless. And I'm curious, as far as the enactment in New Jersey, Lauren, Elaine, how has that emerged? Because I feel like there is a certain point at which even if politics, if you have a broad view of politics, but the idea of climate justice may stretch too far. So what does that look like in practice in New Jersey, as far as the mention of it, the conceptualization, operationalizing it? Thank you.
Well, I think I can share a bit about my experience in my district in the classroom, but also with the work that Subject to Climate has been doing. The New Jersey Climate Education Hub is the website that was built out by Subject to Climate, including a network of stakeholders, including Dr. Madden and the Sustainability Institute at TCNJ and Sustainable Jersey for Schools, the New Jersey Audubon Society. There are quite a few partners and organizations that worked alongside of teachers to develop that. And what we created initially were resources that would be tagged relevant to New Jersey. And then I was one of the original fellows that wrote lesson plans, K to 12, that specifically took the New Jersey climate education standards and developed interdisciplinary lesson plans for teachers with resources and content relevant to students in New Jersey. So widely across the state, teachers would have access to that. So, and even just to step back a moment about the work of professional development and how we roll this out in New Jersey and what does it look like. It's sort of a two-pronged effort. You need what Dr. Madden talked about, in that you need those in-person PD events where teachers can have those conversations with each other. But you also need a source for the resources. As you said, Riley, there is so much work being done out there. But as a classroom teacher with a finite amount of time to find the resources and check the credibility and know that they will be meaningful for your students, can be challenging when you're looking for any teaching materials. So what's been amazing about Subject to Climate and the Hub for New Jersey is those resources are already reviewed by climate scientists. They're checked for credibility, they're checked for authenticity, they're connected to standards, they're relevant for particular grade levels. So when you go through there as a teacher, you know that you can click on a lesson, all teacher-facing documents, student-facing documents, the slide deck, everything you need, you can review it and be prepared to teach it pretty quickly. So I think it's just important to think about the process as this rolls out in different states and locales. Is how are you supporting teachers? And currently, New Jersey Department of Education has supported this work with climate education grants, both for higher ed institutions as well as for local school districts to apply for funding, which essentially supports teachers who choose a project that is outdoors and experiential and an action climate solution for their students. They will have time for professional development. They will be able to write unit plans or lesson plans. And aside from that, right now, Subject to Climate is working also in partner with Sustainable Jersey for Schools. We're developing 50 new lesson plans for the New Jersey Climate Education Hub that are interdisciplinary, K-5. We'll also have bilingual education unit plans, and those are due to be published by the end of September. So going into next school year, what is that next source of resources for teachers at that primary level who, as you said, Riley, often feel unprepared, or they had a course in how to teach science in their undergraduate work. So we're excited about that work. And the teachers that I meet with throughout New Jersey, that's what they keep reiterating, is that they want to learn more about it. They want to feel that they understand it better to be better prepared to teach it, but they also need a place to start. And they need those foundational lessons and those first experiences to get rolling. So I think that has been a helpful approach.
So if I could go off the rail just a minute, Lauren, I'll come right back to you. I just want to give a timeline so people kind of understand New Jersey's progression, because we're referring to certain things in New Jersey. So around 2020, the legislation passed for the climate standards. And there was basically, it passed as kind of an unfunded mandate. We want these standards out there. We want you to teach them. We want you to control for them in instructional processes. And it wasn't until 2023, the 2023 school year, we saw the first funding come out in the state of New Jersey. And this was a small grant process specifically to the schools that said, hey, it's up to $7,500 for training for your teachers, for a program for your schools. It's very flexible in the sense of just get started, do something, get started at your local level. So it's district by district, and almost every district could apply for that grant fund at that time. This last year, or this current year that we're actually in right now, we saw the most kind of strategic move in New Jersey with the new position in the state of New Jersey that's kind of the climate overseer. I call her the climate czar. So she is really strategic around this, but she's created kind of these two levels. Her office has created these two levels. One level being the higher education level, and really engaging the universities in creating these training and resource hubs, kind of like what Subject to Climate is doing, but also at the university level to make it local and more place-based. So there's funding associated to that. So the universities, they gave out X number of grants to the universities to create these platforms for training of local teachers. But simultaneously, they gave local grants to the learning organizations, we call them LEAs, where they were able to apply for up to, I think it's 34,000, 35,000, that they could really start a program. They could start an initiative. They could start to do training. They couldn't use it to offset cost of employees, but could use it for lots of other things. So this became kind of the second stage of implementation in the state of New Jersey, and it's really progressed us forward through that. So they're still releasing those grants. We're not quite sure, at least from my end, what districts have received them, who even applied for them, but it's still moving in that direction. So that's kind of where we are in the timeline. So I'll hand it back over to you, Lauren, about that kind of progression.
So yeah, thank you. So I have two other little pieces to add there. So, and one of the things you mentioned, Riley, was the Sarah Loudly Sterling, who is now the director of climate education at the state level. She sort of came in between those points, which I think is really important, that there's someone sort of steering the ship, which is really great. And also the standards in all subjects except English language arts and mathematics rolled out in the 22-23 school year. ELA and mathematics will roll out in the next school year. Those are a little bit looser guidelines. They're not quite as granular as the ones in the other subject areas. So we'll be in complete implementation starting this next school year coming up. But I wanted to kind of go back to that point on climate justice, because that's something that, you know, I think the NAAEE, that's the North American Association for Environmental Education. I believe I was at one of their meetings where they said no doom and gloom till 4th grade, right? So 9 or 10-year-olds. And I think sadly, because of the way our world is changing, we can't avoid some of the gloom and doom that does come up even for younger kids. And you know, we have to be cognizant, especially when we're working with our older children, that not every child in New Jersey experiences climate change in the same way. There were schools that were closed for weeks on end in Paterson, New Jersey, because of rain this year. And when we think of the rain, we've had historic rain this year. You know, a justice issue for a 5-year-old in kindergarten is when you can't play outside and move your body in the fresh air because of the soggy rain, right? And I think when we understand those personalized experiences of climate justice and climate injustice, that's a good starting point. And maybe the 5 or 6-year-old who understands that their day-to-day experience is going to be different as our world is changing, by the time they're 10 or 11 years old, they can understand that their experience may be different than other people in our state. And that's certainly different than someone experiencing climate change in Pakistan or places in the global South, where we don't have the same sorts of infrastructure in place. So I think it's absolutely critical that the justice issue is part of the conversation. A great way to think about that is especially at the youngest years, is personalization and how it affects my day-to-day life differently, but also ensuring that we have these multilingual resources, which is one of the great tools coming out now that Subject to Climate is and the Climate Hub are working on, to make sure that we're giving this information to all students. You know, the word clima in Spanish means both weather and climate. So if we're worried about kids learning the difference between that, we've got to be a lot more careful than just using Google Translate, right? So I think as curriculum developers and professional development professionals, we have to be mindful that we're preparing teachers to use a justice-focused approach when they're teaching about climate. And I do believe everyone I've spoken with who I know is working really, really hard in this area is certainly taking that approach.
Do
And I
you
think
mind
it's
if
such a,
Oh,
go ahead,
sorry.
Lauren.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so through our work, we found that climate action education specifically has been such a great catalyst for change around this idea of working with marginalized populations, whether they're students with special needs or marginalized communities in different forms and fashions around the world, because it is a unifying factor. The climate change is affecting us all, maybe in different ways, but it is affecting us all. So it really pushes us towards more of the globalization conversation and really starts to impact those type of things. And I think that's one of the advantages of New Jersey, is that it is looking at climate education through the lens of quality education, through the lens of teaching and learning practices across the standards. And it's not compartmentalizing it down to, you have an additional climate education course you have to teach. That's a very distinct difference that some states are doing that other states are not.
Do you mind, Riley, if I step in here?
Sure.
You talked a little bit about younger kids. So this is an area both a personal and professional area of interest of mine, which is the idea of teaching very young children or early grades issues that seem otherwise too heady or too complex. And I think that that's a misconception, but two, it's a cumulative. There's a cumulative component to this, right? So if you start with the foundational concepts of connection to nature, for example, which we know is very predictive of pro-environmental behaviors and values and attitudes later in life, but the idea that we help each other, and so some of these sort of unnamed blocks, social emotional skills, foundational competencies, as part of being a cooperative, collaborative human being, can be integrated in service of climate action later on. But I'm curious, when it comes to actual climate education, could both of you talk a little bit about what that looks like in the early grades? So I'm thinking like kindergarten through 2nd or 3rd grade, when, you know, otherwise people might think it can't be taught or it will depress kids. Like what does that look like, both in theory and in action, in terms of not no doom and gloom, but like how can we do that in a way that's not doom and gloomy?
Would you like me to go first?
Sure, why not?
So you're completely 100% right about this being a concern of many, of how this happens in a classroom, but also how important it is to start with the youngest of children, because it does make it more understandable as they grow. So I can give an example from my teaching experience in my school district. Our first graders always enjoyed the experience of monarch butterflies and the life cycle of that. And years ago, before our school garden, we hatched the caterpillars in classrooms. They had a big release day, and it was exciting for the children to observe that. Fast forward, school garden is implemented. I worked with a local master gardener, and we created a pollinator garden that was certified as a monarch way station. So as those plants grew, we then had our own caterpillars appearing, as the children thought, in the school garden. And so those could be collected and protected and viewed. And we would have about 25 to 30 on any given year, that many caterpillars to watch and observe, and then butterflies to release. Some would be kept in the classroom, some would be protected in the garden, so we could observe out there. 2 summers ago, we had quite a drought in northwestern New Jersey. Very unusual. We water everything in the summer anyway, but this was like no other summer as far as the heat and the lack of rain. When students returned to school in September, the milkweed hadn't survived the summer, most of it, in spite of the watering. Well, that is part of the life cycle. No milkweed, no caterpillars. That school year, we had less than 5 caterpillars that we could observe and track and watch. So what does that mean? We could have just ended it there. Oh, we have less this year. I tasked older students to research and figure out why, rather than telling them why. And then they created information to share with younger students that could be understood by a 5 or a 6-year-old. They all experienced it because year after year, they had that same experience in first grade. So your 5th and 6th grade students remembered what it was like, but now they had the understanding, because of the foundation we had built, that the climate was changing, and here was a direct impact into their school garden. They were able to share that with the young students and talk about weather and climate, and basically make that sort of bridge that gap for those students to understand that something unusual happened. It wasn't really predicted, it was different, and it changed the landscape of our garden, both how it looks and what could live there. So for a 5 or a 6-year-old, that mattered. That was important. It wasn't doom and gloom, but it was an experiential approach. And then the next connection I could make as years go on would then circle back to talking about what happened that particular summer. We also have a lot of winters with no snow days and no snow to play in. So I wanted to highlight that as an example, just one example in the classroom of how taking that approach to look outside your window of where you are with the youngest of students and begin there.
So I'm also going to use an outdoor learning example. So I think you're going to find some common threads here. So I recently worked with 3rd graders at several different schools near here in central New Jersey. And one of the things we did was we used the Seek app by iNaturalist, where you can just kind of take pictures of animals and plants around you. And we did a survey of the schoolyard, like what's native and what's non-native and what's invasive, and how is non-native and invasive a little bit different. And 3rd graders knew when they identified those invasive plants that have root structures that don't support taking care of all this extra water that we're getting with all this extra rain, then we're going to have soggier school grounds, right? So they knew that they could personally take action to get rid of some of that bamboo and plants that were also sort of taking over parts of their schoolyard, and actually see the difference in their own, with their own 2 hands on their own school property. I think when we give kids action-focused solutions to things, and also a strong understanding of where they live and where they go to school, physically all of the living things around them is really important. Another thing I think is really to not overthink it too much either, right? So every kindergarten classroom I have ever been in has a weather chart that they do every single day. Explaining to kindergartners, to 5-year-olds, the difference between weather, which is day-to-day changes, and climate, which is long-scale changes and trends, is perfectly appropriate. And that's completely understandable by a kindergartner. And if they really walk out of kindergarten at 5 or 6 years old with that solid understanding, they're ready to build on that foundation and to think a little bit more critically about different climates in different places in the world, which is something we talk a lot about in social studies. Also, a lot of early elementary social studies is looking at maps of where we are. And it's not much of a jump to go from maps to aerial photographs of how coastlines have changed and, green spaces have changed over time. And those are totally appropriate things for, kindergarten through second graders to really take a look at and have a personal understanding of before we need to get into that complex mathematics or vocabulary load that we'll introduce later when the kids have a solid foundation.
I think there's so many great examples. And I think that we could talk for hours about the examples, but I want to just be cognizant of time so we make sure we have time for follow-up questions. But I do have one more kind of hard-hitting question because I'm the data guy. I love data. So I know, Lauren, you're working on evaluation of both process and implementation. So when we think about these, how are we evaluating the success of the program or any areas that we need to reconsider, both in the implementation side and kind of the educational outcome side?
Yeah, so that's one of the pieces that we're doing. And I also want to express some gratitude for our State Department of Education here as well. So they have funded the Sustainability Institute at TCNJ to do some of their work in climate education. And part of that was a subaward to me and my team, where we've been doing a statewide study. There are 21 counties in New Jersey. So we designed a study where we observed one teacher at each grade level in each county. So one elementary, one middle, one high school teacher in each of the 23 counties. So we observed them at their invitation, teaching a lesson about climate change in any subject. And then we followed that up with an interview to learn a little bit more about their professional learning experiences and their preparation and what sorts of materials they're using. So right now we're sort of wrapping up data collection there. We've the goal was 63, right? There were 21 counties. We're at about the 50 mark, which I think is great. There's only one county that we haven't had any respondents from, but it is very small and rural. So we're able to sort of get a big picture. I should say, probably not surprisingly, the bulk of the teachers who volunteered to participate in this study were folks who had been teaching about climate change for some time, who were very confident, with teaching about the topic. And that was especially early on in the process. Some of the counties that it's been a little bit more challenging to recruit teachers from. We've seen folks maybe a little bit earlier on in their journey teaching in this area. But I have to say, I've been thrilled. I really thought I was going to see almost all science lessons. And while science is the largest content area we're seeing, we've seen world languages. Spanish teachers are doing amazing things right now at the high school level, especially talking about and it's important to talk about something in when you're learning a language, right? And climate is a wonderful example to look at cross-cultural comparisons. I've seen some wonderful English lessons. Our art teachers are amazing. They're doing really incredible things. A lot of social studies. I saw a wonderful 8th grade lesson looking at global trade and how that affects increases in ship traffic and how that affects our planet, and it really, really amazing things. So we will have our report to the state, a very top level this summer, to be able to give just some quantitative findings about the differences here. But my intention over the next 6 months or so is to really unpack these and to try and dig deep into the data supporting the best prepared teachers. What kinds of things are they doing? What kinds of materials are they using? What kind of support do they have from their districts and colleagues? So that we can really have a solid understanding of what this looks like. I have not heard yet about when the state testing is going to be updated to reflect the new standards. I suspect that'll be sometime in the next few years. Typically our standards updates are not exactly 1-in-1 followed by the update and the testing, but we'll probably have some more quantitative numbers at that point. Yeah, so it'll be really interesting to see where this goes.
Are you doing any splits around the implementation from 2020 to 2023, 23, and then 24 to see if those implementations have impacted in any different way?
So I think that's a really interesting study. And we'd like to have a look at that. I did
I'm
some
proposing
work.
it.
That's okay. So I did some work with some colleagues at TCNJ as well as at Subject to Climate. So Margaret Wang and Julia Turner worked with us on, we surveyed teachers just before the implementation. And then 6 months after. I think I'd like to send that survey back out again. So I could find the link for that, but that's a white paper on the Subject to Climate page where we talk to teachers about their preparedness. It would be nice to add some questions now about the about how they're viewing their students' progress in the class too. But yeah, so we will put that survey out once again and see sort of where it lands us.
I want to give the last word to Lauren Simmons, and then we'll kind of open it up for questions. I know there's so much more to share, but just want to be cognizant of everybody's time, and we only have a few minutes left. So, Lauren.
Sure. No, this has been so great, and I have many more questions to ask, but I did want to pull up what Yolande said, and she invited our non-US colleagues, or our colleagues rather, who work in non-US settings, if they have examples to share on teaching strategies from their specific contexts. I can provide one just to kick us off. If you have one, please feel free to share it in the chat, or if you're able to come off mute. I don't know if we have that setting enabled, but for example, I just had a colleague who is based out of Bangkok, and she, I don't know, for those of you who don't know, they've had extreme heat right now. The heat index the other day was 127 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just unreal to think about. AC is available in some places, but not in many, and not in most. And she went to her it was actually at her son's preschool classroom, and led a discussion in which kids not only, they talked about how they felt about how hot it was, what they weren't able to do, what they could do. And then they had a brainstorming session in small groups and drew pictures of things that they could do, sort of strategies that they could implement to cool. And it went beyond just AC. It was conversations about how to reuse materials to stay cool, like creating shade shelters. And these are like 3 and 4-year-olds. And I think that we do a disservice to our very young children when we don't give them a chance to explore what that looks like in practice and to respond to the situation on the ground. But we have one from Drew in Laos. They just completed this very long curriculum review process for primary school, and it was not included. So strategically need to, one, focus on secondary curriculum and be prepared and leverage non-formal teaching approaches. Here we are using the Upshift approach contextualized. It's a new initiative to work with a local science teacher who will do cricket farming and teach on protein and climate plus youth enterprise. Very interesting, fascinating. Drew, do you want to say, are you able to share, do we have the option to have folks come off mute?
Yes, I can.
Drew, I'd love to hear more. If you're able to share more.
I don't know if I'm enabled to, oh, you guys, okay.
You're good, Drew.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, the Upshift approach I can put in there. It really needs to be contextualized because it's basically building transferable skills. You get young people together to do like a health check on their community, identify challenges, and then work together to come up with solutions. For us, our entry point is going to be air quality and looking at like trash burning. So that, I mean, it's really like, so for me, the challenge is how do you look at climate and the environment and then come up with solutions that are actionable, by young people at the community level. So you can't talk about like, slash and burn agriculture, or like greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it's just like these huge challenges. So we're trying to start small. And then, I met a local science teacher who teaches at one of the French schools, who had this small project with cricket farming, because that way you can introduce kind of like, okay, meat-based or cow-based diets are harmful for the environment, and clear cutting forests. And so if we can think about different protein sources, and locally crickets are like a delicacy. And so that's like one way to teach kids about climate, these bigger issues. But as you guys are talking about with, the butterflies, like it's a really kind of hands-on approach that I'm really excited to. We haven't started it yet. He's just we've kind of been meeting and discussing the idea. And then, I mean, there's also like a market. So for young people, like if you can support building the markets, and you're kind of checking all these different boxes in terms of like teaching on climate, creating potentially income generating opportunities, and linking to markets. Because in terms of if you go to the markets here, meat is super cheap, whereas crickets are really expensive. So it's like a higher value commodity, which is something that you wouldn't really think of maybe, outside of the context. Thanks for letting me share that. Over.
No, thanks so much, Drew. That's great. And I think something to note too is the idea not just about responding to immediate action, or having an action orientation to an immediate challenge, but identifying sort of the intersections between things like why is slash and burn a common practice. I wanted to end with what Julie asked, which I think is a good note to end on, which is, given the experience that you've had, what type of guidance would you give our attendees here on identifying and cultivating champions for climate education? Maybe a minute each. Elaine, if you're, go ahead.
I just want to jump in. I'm sorry. I have to jump for another call, but I don't want this conversation to stop. So Lauren, I'm going to hand it to you in your wonderful hands to manage the final wrap up. But I just wanted to thank everybody for your time and your wonderful conversation. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Riley.
So I think I can speak to, so if you're locally in your school district, your school building, that's a place to start in looking for some of those partners. And in my world, it was connecting with other teachers that wanted to expand this work and take their students outside and do different experiments and challenges and things of that nature. And then reaching out from my district, looking for connections with Sustainable Jersey for Schools and professional development. So going and creating a network and finding people who are also trying to find resources and bringing this into their classroom and wanting to learn more. And so as the teacher perspective, that's how you can begin to cast your net to gather in people. And then I'll hand it over to Lauren, because from there, our university partners and the teacher preparation and teacher training there and the PD they offer. I'll pass it to her to share more.
So it's something I think I need to do a little bit more work on myself, but I think some of the things we can do to elevate some of these superstars out there, both our students and the teachers in our schools, is really nominate them for awards and make posts about them on social media and make sure that the world sees what's happening. I think a lot of us kind of turn our heads to Greta Thunberg because she made a name for herself on the global stage about the work that she's doing. And there are thousands of Gretas out there, both in front of the classroom and in the seats. And I think we need to do what we can to make these voices known. And I think even in tough political situations, one of the best things we can do is elevate the voice of children, because they are the ones who are going to be leading this world one day. So I think we have to make it as easy as possible to access high quality professional learning and to make sure all teachers feel comfortable and that all kids have access to this kind of learning. But I also think some of our responsibility as the adults and some of the thought leaders in this situation is that we're elevating the voices of those superstars out there, both the teachers and the children.
Well, I think that is such a great note to end on. I thank our panelists for all of the insights that you've shared. Yolande, do you want to end with any follow-up and any other closing thoughts?
I would not dare. I wouldn't dare. This was fantastic. Thank you. We learned so much from you. We'll follow up, but thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you to our attendees. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Bye,
having us.
bye. Of
Yes, no
course,
worries.
my goodness.